My Greek teacher used to say a text without a context is a pretext. And so if we want to understand chapter 12, what are we going to have to do? We need to see what's behind it a little bit. We need to get some context. So we're going to go back to Luke chapter 11. And in Luke chapter 11, you have Jesus with the disciples, with the Pharisees, at a Pharisee's house where they were invited guests to be there for a meal together. And at that meal together, things did not go very well, as we would look at it. Because Jesus did something, actually failed to do something that it was perceived that he should have done. He did not wash his hands before it was time to eat. This was not a problem with dirt or germs. This was a problem because of impurity, spiritually speaking, in the minds of the Pharisees because of their rules and regulations that Jesus didn't subscribe to. And so it became an awkward situation, and he got called out by the Pharisees for not washing his hands before eating and asking why he didn't do that. And this is how he responded. I'm going to have to get closer to this machine if I'm going to make this work well, I believe. Oh, there's a thought. We can do that. If it all reaches, we'll see. Perfect. Thank you. So, we're going to go back a little bit just to get the text to work. So Jesus said, "Now then, I'm better get out of the way. You Pharisees clean the outside of the cup and dish, but inside you're full of greed and wickedness. Woe to you, because you are all like unmarked graves which men walk over without knowing it." How do you think that went over? I mean, think about it. How many people were inside the house? You've got Jesus and how many disciples? 12. That's 13. You've got the Pharisees, we don't know how many. And we've probably got some women, maybe even some children, that are present in the house. Had to be a big house. Pharisees' houses back then were quite large. So that's happening inside the house. It's a good-sized group. Things are not going well. And Jesus has this to say. And then, can you imagine the awkwardness that meal must have... It doesn't tell us much about the meal. We don't know what they ate. We don't know what they talked about. It may have been definitely silent during that meal. This was an awkward meal, I'm sure. It doesn't say much about that. But we know that the disciples had to have some concerns about what Jesus had just done. I mean, if you were a disciple and your teacher, your mentor, your rabbi has just made the leadership of the Christian of the spiritual community irate with you. You must not be feeling very good about the situation. And so when they end up outside the house, Jesus needs to speak first to the disciples. And when you begin Luke chapter 12, you find Jesus coming outside the house. And what you find outside the house is just as surprising as what's inside the house. Because outside the house, outside the house, the Bible says, "Meanwhile, when a crowd of many thousands had gathered so that they were trampling on one another, Jesus began to speak, first to his disciples." How many people were outside the house? Thousands. In some translations, it says a great multitude. But when you see this going on, do you suppose when Jesus was inside the house that the Pharisees on the inside of the house knew how many were outside the house? You think they knew that there was a crowd outside? How do you not know? if there are thousands of people outside the house waiting to see Jesus, who's inside the house, that's probably why they didn't get more upset than they did at that moment with Jesus, or that they didn't act out like they felt like acting out probably to him at that time, because Jesus was insanely popular with the people. So Jesus goes outside the house, and notice that it says he speaks first to the disciples. And he says, if you're reading through the chapter there, you got to watch out for these Pharisees. He's debriefing a little bit, helping them understand where he's coming from and why he did what he did. And then he begins to teach the people. And this happens in around verse 12, where you have this fella, and I believe the artist that painted this picture had this very story in mind in Luke chapter 12. And I believe that this is the culprit right here that the artist was thinking about. Thousands of people around, and he looks up at Jesus and he says, "Teacher, tell my brother to divide the inheritance with me." Now you look at this and you think, seriously? Really? Would you ask? I mean, who among us would have the nerve in a situation like this when you have a master teacher and a crowd of thousands of people, and he's starting to talk to the people about spiritual things, and you come up and interrupt him and tell him what to do with your inheritance? Really? I don't suppose any of you know of anybody that's had an issue with an inheritance. Isn't it interesting how we can get worked up over stuff like that? Things didn't go down the way we thought they should. Things didn't get divided the way they thought that we thought they should. We should have gotten a piece of that, and we didn't. So many people, so many families get so messed up over stuff like this. And Jesus recognizes that this is a problem, and he doesn't see the problem as the same as the young man that's coming up to him. He realizes that what's really going on here. He sees, first of all, that there is a dispute. And this is a dispute between two people. They're from the same race. They're from the same tribe. They're from the same family. And Jesus realizes that the real issue here is not how the estate was divided. The real issue is greed. So he decides he needs to speak to the issue, and he makes this a teachable moment to talk to the entire congregation. Jesus was a master teacher, wasn't he? Verse 14, but he said to him, "Man, who made me a judge or an arbiter over you?" And he said to them, who's he talking to now? The crowd, right? "Take heed and beware of covetousness." That's our key text. "For one's life does not consist in the abundance of the things he possesses." Oh, but we think they do. Don't we? Sometimes? We wouldn't say it out loud, especially at church. But don't we often think that life consists of what we have? I remember reading this book. Actually, this is an article. I've got another book I'm going to share with you in a moment. But there's in Harvard Business Review, I believe this was 2016. It says why rich people aren't as happy as they could be. And first thing that they found out in the research is that wealth makes us less generous, both in dollar terms and in behavioral respects. Consider results from a series of studies done by Paul Piffin and his colleagues from the University of Berkeley. In one study, participants were paired to play a game of Monopoly. The game was rigged so that one of the participants quickly became far wealthier than the other. The researchers then observed through a one-way mirror the participant's behavior. It turned out that the wealthier a participant grew, the meaner he or she progressively became. For example, the wealthier participants started assuming more dominant postures and began talking down to their poorer counterparts. They also consumed a greater share of a bowl of pretzels meant to be shared equally. Excuse me. Results from another study showed similar effects. When given $10 and told they could contribute any or all of it to another participant, the richer participants contribute on average 44% less. In the world outside the lab, researchers have found that wealthier people tend to give a smaller percentage of their income to charity. Go figure. The more you have, the less you give. You wouldn't think it's that way. If I just had, then I could. Not really. Doesn't seem to work out that way. Not naturally, not unless we're following a different call in our life. And so I thought it would be good to point that out. The second piece that they found out in this particular study is that wealth makes us more isolated. You've probably seen it. I mean, the article goes into it, but the bigger place you get, you get from your apartment to a house. You no longer have all these friends that are hanging around with, and then you get from that house to a bigger house, and a bigger house, and the fenced yard, and a gated community, and you're more and more isolated to protect your stuff. You don't have as many friends. We were designed to be social creatures. God made us that way, and we have become more and more isolated, and wealth tends to do that to us. Just saying. He said to them, "Take heed and beware of covetousness, for one's life does not consist in the abundance of the things he possesses." In this book by Tim Castor, The High Price of Materialism, he tells the story of Jim Clark, the founder of Netscape and other companies, who said, "I would be happy if I had $10 million. Well, that was before Netscape. After Netscape and he got $10 million, he said, "I would be happy if I had $100 million. That was before Healthion, and after Healthion, he had $100 million, and he said, I'd be happy if I had $1 billion. And then he got $1 billion, and he said, "You know what, I'd really be happy if I had as much as Larry Ellison." Larry Ellison at that time was worth $13 billion. Castor shows that rich people are not necessarily happier than those who are not rich, provided their basic needs are met. In fact, those who pursue wealth, even if they do so successfully, are generally less happy than those who do not make that their pursuit. And with that background, consider this: many wealthy people are little more than janitors of their possessions. Happens so often. I could get into lots of illustrations of this. I'm going to pass over some in order to get to the main point of Luke chapter 12. We haven't gotten there yet. It's what Jesus does next. He tells another story. Jesus was the master storyteller, and he tells this story of so many people, and getting into the story, so many people are simply hazards from chasing a mirage of more. So Jesus is going to tell us a story to help us with this problem. It's the story of the rich fool, beginning in Luke 12, verse 16. Here's the story. "And he told them this parable. The ground of a certain rich man produced a good crop. He thought to himself, 'What shall I do? I have no place to store my crops.' Then he said, 'This is what I'll do. I will tear down my barns and build bigger ones, and there I will store all my grain and my goods. And I'll say to myself,'" oops, lost it. "I'll say to myself, 'You have plenty of good things laid up for your many years. Take life easy, eat, drink, and be merry.'" Can you tell me what the rich fool's problem was? He had eye trouble. That's right. He had eye trouble. So he goes on to say this: "But God said to him, 'You fool, this very night your life will be demanded from you. Then who will get what you have prepared for yourself? This is how it will be with,'" what's that next word? "'Anyone who stores up things for himself, but is not rich toward God.'" Anyone Who is included in anyone? Everyone, right? Okay, so with that thought in mind, let's take into consideration what the rich fool's problem was not. The rich fool's problem was not that he was rich. Can you think of rich people in the Bible that God commended? Zacchaeus. Who else? Abraham? Job. Who else? New Testament. Zacchaeus was New Testament. Okay, someone mentioned Solomon, the Old Testament. Nicodemus, right? Joseph of Arimathea. So being rich was not the problem. And by the way, was the rich man already rich when God blessed him with more? Yes, he was. There was a certain rich man, the story said. So he was already rich, and God blessed him with more. He had God's blessing. The problem was not that he was rich. The problem was that he didn't appropriately deal with the riches that he was given and recognize their source and respond appropriately. The problem was not that he was blessed with more riches. So the problem was, Jesus said, this is how it will be with anyone who stores up things for himself, but is not rich toward God. Which calls us to do some introspection, I would hope. To think about, what about me and my life, and how am I doing in being rich toward God? It's not that I'm giving because I'm rich. It's because I'm His. And I respond by giving back because I have a heart relationship with Him. And so when we think about this challenge with the rich fool, it causes us to think about our own self and what would God want us to do. How do we respond to this challenge? Could this be our problem too? I'd like to suggest that we all have a tendency to chase the mirage. If we don't fight it, by the power of the Holy Spirit in our lives and spending time with Jesus to help us to work on this, but when we are blessed with more, whatever the more might be, what does the Bible tell us we ought to be doing? Share. Be rich toward God, right? If God has been rich toward us, if God does something to bless us, we get a pay raise at work. We get a bonus at the end of the year. The federal government sends us a check that we weren't expecting. Something unusual happens. You've been blessed with more, that we then should be thinking about how can I be rich toward God, right? That's what we're told here. And it's not just that, it's our time, our talents, our resources, whatever we have, it seems that we can be rich toward God, regardless of our income status. It's an attitude of life. It's something that follows us wherever we go. I'd just like to challenge all of us to think about that. And as we're thinking about it, I'd like to close with some next steps. And I've got some, I think one of the deacons has some cards to pass out right now, real quick, as we wrap things up. No? Does anybody have some cards that were given to pass out? There were some that. Oh, I think right here on the note. They're next to you on the. There are two things. The cards there, and I want everyone to have one of these. So you can help me pass them out if you don't mind. Okay. So yeah, they're perfect. And these are just. I'd like every family to have one of these, just so you can know a little bit more about our department and what we do. So a little card, a little challenge for you, something to think about. If you don't have something to write with, maybe you can grab something after the service if you'd like to turn something in for me. First one says, I will read Luke 12:13-21 thoughtfully. I will consider ways to be rich toward God. I will pray for God's help, remember Him when I am blessed with more. Those are the things that you might want to do. Next one says, I would like to visit with someone from Plan Giving and Trust Services about will preparation or estate planning. There may be someone here, maybe you don't know how we do things, but if you don't currently have a will and money is the reason, talk to us, because we can provide a will for you. Actually, you would go to an attorney, pay for it, save the receipt, call me up and say, I just saw an attorney and I'd like to get reimbursed for this, and you give me the receipt and we'll send you a check. Is that fair enough? We'll pay for it. You get a simple will. We don't typically do that for like a trust or something like that. But if people are in need, sometimes parents with children, you want to make sure you've got somebody to take care of those kids if something happens. You got a plan in place. And we don't want to make it a hardship for you to be able to do that. And we do not require that you leave anything for the church. But what we've discovered is that it's worth paying for me to get around to the churches and talk about this, because when we sit down and think about it, we really would like to remember the Lord's work in our will or in our trust in some way. So much so that, and what typically happens if we don't say something about it, people don't do anything about it, and then it's up to the state to figure out what to do with it, and they're not going to consider your charitable intentions. So that's why I do what I do. So I can help go around and help people know about this sort of thing. And I'm also the stewardship director of the conference because, really, we can often do more while we're alive than after we pass. So thinking about what we can do to further the Lord's work in some way is what I'm here for. And I'd love to sit down with you if you'd like and just talk about it. If sometimes people have a complex situation, they're trying to figure out the best angle for taxes or capital gains problems and that kind of thing. And that's something that I've been trained in to help people with knowing options for those kinds of situations. Not to tell you what to do, but to just share some possible options to consider. And so if anyone is in that position, you'd like to talk to me about it, do so. I don't think this particular slide is going to have something else that I wanted to put that on the other. I didn't update this particular version yet. But does anyone know, if you wanted to go on the conference website and all you had was a web browser and you couldn't use a Google search, do you know what the web address is? Yes, you get an A. nnec.org. I don't know how they got such a great website name because it's so short. Northern New England Conference, nnec.org. Very simple, very short. They must have been in the first wave, to get online. And so now we've started a new website. And the new website, I think, is just as important and wonderful as the first one. And they're both important and valuable. But last year, the fruit of my labors and help with some other people, and Dustin, our communications director for the conference, we spent a lot of time on this. We started a new website, and it is nnecgift.org. nnecgift.org. I was going to have that on the screen for you, but I don't have it there right now. So I just wanted you to know about that because in addition to that, we started a new newsletter from the Plan Giving and Trust Services Department, and it's all about savvy living, tax issues, financial things, especially for people that are getting older. If you're thinking about retirement and what's the best way to do this or that, and you have charitable intent, what are ideas, and it triggers all kinds of, it gives stories that trigger virtually every week when I'm sent this, we've curated this through a provider, Crescendo. They are just the kind of the leader for this sort of thing for people that are working in the work that I do. So they focused on charitable giving, and so they have 5 attorneys that help to develop this newsletter, and we've kind of worked it out so they know exactly the kind of thing we're looking for on our end. And I'm always intrigued with it. My wife is getting it, and she started out by reading the newsletter and asking me a question that I was like, where did that come from? It was a fantastic tax question about retirement, and I said, where did you get that? She said, from your newsletter. And I hadn't looked at my own copy yet, but she had gotten it that morning. So it's a free newsletter. It comes weekly, and I thought, that's too often. And you might think it's too often, and if you don't like the frequency, you can always change the frequency to twice a month or once a month or whatever you want. But or you can opt out completely. But if you would like to get the newsletter, check the box, and I'll put you on the list. If you want to do it yourself, you can get online, NNEC, what was it? NNECgift.org. And one of the first options, if you look at that first landing page, you'll find the free newsletter is available. You can click there and sign up for it. Heavenly Father, may it be so. Help us to be sincerely yours. May we always follow you, serve you, love you, and be rich toward you. We thank you in Christ's name.